This area right here is where our mind usually goes when you think of the word pirates. Jamaica's Port Royal, Tortuga, Nassau. You know, the Caribbean, the home of swashbuckling, rum-sipping, hands, legs, and eyes missing adventurers, treasure hunters, and violent thieves, terrorizing coastlines and the sea. Whether it be historically accurate or completely fictional, pirates served as the inspiration for some darn good stories, arguably some of the best that were ever written or put on film. But hundreds of years before the Blackbeards and the Jack Sparrows terrorized the Caribbean seas, pirate history was made on the opposite side of the globe, out on the open ocean of East Asia. There was rarely a boring moment here. I mean, these waters are located right between none other than China, Korea, and Japan, three cultural and economic powerhouses that share a whole bunch of history between each other. And in the case of Japan, an island nation separated from the rest of the world by a vast ocean. That same ocean became the only thing that connected them to their influential Asian mainland neighbors. And so, with all that sea traffic coming in and out of the land of the rising sun, it's only natural that very early on, there were also those looking to cause all kinds of trouble out in the seas in and around Japan, aka pirates. The history of Japanese piracy is vast, complex, and old. But that is exactly the kind of history that we enjoy the most, isn't it? So let's explore it all together, from the first pirate king of Japan to the famous Murakami Pirates and the vast, multi-ethnic and transcontinental network of Wakou pirates that dominated the East Asian seas for centuries. Should you end up enjoying this swashbuckling Japanese pirate history adventure, leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel to see more of this kind of content in your feed in the future. And if you really want to help me out, then come join my crew over at Patreon, where even a small monthly donation of $1 is greatly appreciated. With that out of the way, time to sail the high seas, my friend. This is the history of Japanese pirates, from the first pirate king to the Wakou. So, Japanese pirates. Well, if you know me, you also know that I like to start from the very beginning when doing these types of history videos. And in this case, that means that we'll have to start by taking just a brief dive into Japan's naval history to start with. Japan's relationship with seafaring, it goes back a long way. I mean, it makes sense. Around 12,000 years ago, the land bridges that once connected the islands of what we now call Japan to the Asian mainland disappeared, leaving them completely isolated. From that point on, or well, at least until the advent of air travel, the sea was Japan's only link to the outside world, most importantly with China and the Korean peninsula. Pinpointing exactly when the inhabitants of Japan first began using boats is tricky. Chinese records suggest that they may have visited Japan as early as 5th century BC. But besides that, what we do know for certain is that by the year 14 AD, Japan already had a well-established naval presence. According to the Samguk Sagi, Korea's oldest known historical document, a fleet consisting of 100 Japanese ships is said to have launched an attack on Korea's eastern coast that year. So that means that the Japanese had seemingly become pretty adept at both building and maneuvering ships by the year 14 AD. But arguably even more relevant to our story than military ventures is the maritime trade. Because where there's cargo, there's also someone looking to steal it. The Japanese trade with China and Korea is thought to date back at least to the 3rd century AD, and it's reasonable to assume that piracy emerged not long after, if not at the same time. It would, however, take a while before the first known mention of the actual word pirates appeared in a Japanese written document. The Japanese term for pirate is Kaizoku, which roughly translates to sea thieves. The famous Nihon Shoki, one of Japan's oldest historical texts, suggests that the term might have been in use as early as the late 5th century. But in 9th century, the Kaizoku were seemingly causing enough trouble to warrant mention in official documents, one of which describes, and I quote, bands of Kaizoku that have recently started to appear. They kill travelers and steal whatever they have with them. End quote. Sounds like pirates to me. And actually, it's also during this very early era in Japanese history that we can already find our first real pirate legend. The tale of a man now often referred to as Japan's first pirate king. Now, you might expect a man with such an ominous title to have come from humble beginnings. Perhaps the rebellious son of a poor fisherman who constantly utters whatever the Japanese equivalent to phrases like ahoy matey might be. But the reality of this story is actually much closer to the opposite. Fujiwara Sumitomo was a nobleman, born around the year 900 into the influential Fujiwara clan, a dominant force within the Japanese imperial court. But despite his noble lineage, Sumitomo himself was a relatively low-ranking official, assigned far away from the capital of Heian-kyo, or modern-day Kyoto. Instead, his domain was Iyo province, located right here within Japan's Seto Inland Sea, where he was tasked with tackling, among other things, the growing piracy problem, a problem that had already become somewhat of a headache for the government. Or actually, one of several headaches, that is, because the inland sea pirates were far from the only source of turmoil in Japan at the time. You see, Sumitomo was born into what was a rather unstable period in Japanese history, because while he was stuck in the south, bored and frustrated with his own position, another nobleman by the name of Taira no Masakado was experiencing similar grievances in a politically still rather insignificant Kanto region to the east. Masakado eventually decided to take action and rebel against the imperial court in the 930s. The first recorded rebellion of its kind in Japanese history. And almost simultaneously, Sumitomo decided to do the same. But instead of an army of samurai, he employed the help of an entire pirate army. The Seto Inland Sea, located along the coast of Iyo province, where Sumitomo spent almost his entire life, was the busiest maritime region in Japan, teeming with ships transporting goods and people. And naturally, that also meant that it became a hotspot for piracy as well. Putting that into consideration, and given Sumitomo's high status in the region, it sorta made sense that when he planned his own revolt against the government, that he would make good use of the inland sea's large population of Kaizoku. The Setouchi's Kaizoku of the 10th century were mostly impoverished fishermen, driven into piracy by widespread famines. Court records show that in the year 936, the government paid off around 30 pirate crews in an attempt to curb their attacks on merchant ships. And while piracy temporarily declined shortly thereafter, it wasn't long before it re-emerged, this time under Sumitomo's command. Instead of suppressing the pirates, which, was kind of his job, he had become their leader, amassing a fleet of roughly 1,000 Kaizoku ships. At that point, the imperial court's attention was entirely on Masakado's massive rebellion in the east. But despite the fact that the history books prefer to talk about Masakado's legendary revolt against the imperial court, which, to be fair, was the first of its kind and therefore very significant, there is a case to be made that Sumitomo's growing pirate army actually posed an even greater concern for the Japanese imperial court. The inland sea wasn't just an economic hub. It was home to powerful nobles, and most importantly, it provided direct access into the heart of the Japanese government. Sumitomo first demonstrated his power in December of 939, ordering an attack on 2 regional governors who had reported his support of the inland sea pirates to the imperial court. As the 2 officials returned home from the capital, they were intercepted by Sumitomo's men, who mutilated them by cutting off their noses and ears. Later, their wives and children were also executed, an unmistakable warning not to interfere with Sumitomo's plans. By the year 940, Sumitomo's pirate army was on the move, launching one attack after another on key government outposts. In February of that year, they struck Awaji province, targeting its armory and administrative offices. By August, they had reached Sanuki province, and in October, they arrived at Hakata and Dazaifu, the latter being Japan's most important center regarding diplomacy and trade with mainland Asia back then. Simultaneously, Sumitomo was clearly closing in on the capital, and so the imperial court decided to finally take decisive action. Luckily for them, Masakado had already been defeated in March of 940, and with one rebellion crushed, they were able to turn their full attention to Sumitomo. They got one of his most trusted lieutenants to betray him, leaking crucial information to the authorities. And in 941, the Imperial Army was ready to launch a full-scale assault, completely annihilating Sumitomo's fleet. 2 weeks later, the Pirate King himself was captured and executed. And with that, the tale of Fujiwara Sumitomo, Japan's first pirate king, had come to an end. But the story of Japanese piracy was far from over. In fact, we're just getting started. Let's fast forward a bit, and by a bit I mean 400 years, to the 14th century. Japan had been through a lot. The rise and fall of the Kamakura shogunate, Japan's first ever feudal military government. The Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281. And yet, some things remained unchanged. The Seto Inland Sea was still a crucial maritime artery, and was still filled to the brim with pirate activity. Perhaps even more so than ever before. It was dominated by a vast array of different groups of Kaizoku, but among them all, one crew in particular stood out. The famous Murakami Pirates. Hailing from the island of Ni-Oshima, the Murakami family first emerged as maritime guards, escorting cargo ships carrying salt through the inland sea. On the surface, this seems like a simple enough job, but the Murakamis took their job very seriously. They meticulously studied the sea's treacherous currents, tides, and hidden hazards. They had unparalleled expertise when it came to the waters of the inland sea, and at some point, this expertise started to catch the attention of the area's most powerful warlords. And before long, the increasingly wealthy Murakami family was captaining its own fleet. By the 16th century, the Murakami Pirates had evolved into the dominant naval force of the inland sea. The family split into 3 branches, with each controlling their own strategic base, located here, here, and here. The most important of them all was this one, located right here on Noshima, a small island fortified by strong currents and concealed rocks. And the Murakami Pirates knew exactly how to profit off these treacherous waters. If you take a closer look, you may notice that Noshima is located right in the middle of what is the shortest possible route through the inland sea. Fully aware of the fact that there were plenty of ships with valuable cargo that wanted to go through here, the Murakami Kaizoku basically set up a maritime toll booth. Any vessel passing through their waters was required to pay a certain fee. How much they paid depended on the size of their cargo. In exchange, the Murakami Pirates would, well, not attack them, but they would also help them navigate through the inland sea if needed. Today, it seems like people love to romanticize the Murakami Pirates as some kind of honorable guardians of the inland sea. A bunch of easygoing fellas that provided safe passage to travelers in exchange for a small fee. But I do wonder, were they actually protectors? Or were they simply a bunch of very skilled extortionists running what is basically nothing more than an elaborate protection racket? Regardless of perspective, they weren't called the Murakami Kaizoku or Murakami Pirates without a good reason. These guys were feared. Ships that paid their toll often received a flag bearing the Murakami crests. And this wasn't just some kind of sweet souvenir. Bringing this flag along was oftentimes the only way to not get attacked on your way through the inland sea. A symbol signifying that your ship was under the protection of the Murakami Kaizoku. No one wanted to mess with these guys, and for good reason. You see, the Murakamis also had a history of serving as straight-up mercenaries, which at one point even pitted them up against the infamous Oda Nobunaga, one of the most ruthless warlords that Japan has ever seen. In 1576, under their legendary leader Murakami Takayoshi, they actually managed to defeat Oda's naval fleet at the First Battle of Kisugawaguchi, before then losing the rematch and later aligning themselves with Oda, reportedly gifting him a baby hawk as a symbol of their loyalty. Now that's sick. Generally though, the Murakamis are said to have been pretty neutral when it came to politics and alliances, aligning themselves with or distancing themselves from warlords and other powerful people in a way that benefited them the most. Their main focus was basically to secure their own safety and survival. That, and the success of their business, of course. Now, it would be false to claim that the Murakamis had some kind of monopoly on the Seto protection business. Other pirate groups, such as the Tagaya family, operated similarly. But none were as notorious as the Murakami Kaizoku. Even today, their name is synonymous with both Japanese piracy and the Seto Inland Sea. However, to find the kind of piracy that is closer to what we usually think of today, you know, the looting, the hijacking and raiding, we will need to leave the inland sea and even the actual word Kaizoku behind, instead turning our attention to the open ocean, where the history of the infamous Wakou awaits. If you look through historical records regarding piracy in Japan and the rest of East Asia, you'll encounter the term Wakou far more often than Kaizoku. And I'm not talking exclusively about Japanese sources here either. Koreans refer to them as Wakou, while the Chinese use the term Wakou, dwarf bandits. And while it might sound like the title of some obscure early 90s arcade beat-em-up game, the Wa in Wakou is apparently a derogatory term that the Chinese historically used when referring to the Japanese. In short, the term Wakou basically just means Japanese pirates. The Wakou dominated the East Asian seas for centuries, with their activity generally divided into two major periods. The first from the 14th to the 15th century, and the second from the 16th to the early 18th century. During these two eras, they plundered, raided, and terrorized coastal settlements all the way from northern China down to Korea and as far south as Guangdong province. Their main bases of operation were located right here, on Iki Island, and most notably here, on Tsushima, an island just 60 kilometers off the Korean peninsula. Tsushima was the ideal hub for piracy to prosper. Its proximity to the mainland made raiding easy, while its rocky, mountainous terrain meant that food shortages were common, especially after the Mongol invasions of the 13th century devastated both Tsushima and Korea. To compensate for the resulting loss of trade, groups of Tsushima residents turned to piracy, simply taking what they didn't have back home out on the open ocean. A practice fully supported by the island's ruling Seoul clan, which saw enormous profits from backing these maritime outlaws. Starting in the 1350s, the Wakou launched relentless attacks on the mainland, with 4 to 5 major raids occurring annually over the course of more than 6 decades. These weren't small-scale robberies. Some raids involved fleets of up to 400 ships carrying over 3,000 pirates. Their primary targets were food supplies, especially convoys that carried grains and cereals meant for transport to Beijing. They also weren't afraid of stepping on land in order to loot entire government granaries that often contained hundreds of tons of grains, a valuable resource for the struggling population of Tsushima. But the Wakou, they weren't content with just looting convoys and granaries. They also engaged in large-scale slavery. Between 1350 and 1420, tens of thousands of Koreans and Chinese are estimated to have been kidnapped and enslaved at the hands of the Wakou, forced into labor on ships, ports, and in the fields. Women, on the other hand, were either trafficked or forced to serve the pirate leaders. Only on rare occasions were highly skilled captives allowed to actually integrate into Japanese society. That being said, given the sheer number of Chinese and Koreans that were brought to Japan over the span of these 60+ years, there is no doubt that they must have had a lasting impact on Japan's cultural and social landscape, especially in the Kyushu region. But beyond food to feed their people and slaves to do their work, the Wakou also looted highly valuable cultural artifacts. Korean statues, bells, paintings, religious relics, and more. Many of these stolen treasures still exist in temples and shrines across Kyushu and its surrounding islands today. For example, Tsushima alone holds hundreds of Korean-made Buddhist statues, as well as the gong of Takusatama Shrine, thought to have been stolen from a monastery near Kaesong in modern-day North Korea in 1357. Similarly, an inscription on a gong excavated in the city of Gyeongju, South Korea, states that it was made to replace another one of its kind, stolen by pirates in 1351. But among the most prized Wakou loot were the massive bells, which they took down from monasteries across Korea before transporting them to Japan, where they fetched a pretty penny. They stole quite a bunch of these. Of the 60 bells of Korean origin identified in Kyushu alone, 11 date back to the peak of Wakou activity during the late 1300s. I could go on and on about the incredibly valuable items that the Wakou stole during this era: ceramics, textiles, books. But while the Wakou plundered China, and especially Korea, the rulers of what was then called Joseon Kingdom didn't sit idly by. Between 1389 and 1419, they launched 3 military campaigns meant to suppress the Japanese pirates. Though these efforts weakened Wakou activity, they didn't eliminate the problem entirely. After unsuccessfully appealing to Japan's Ashikaga shogunate for assistance in exchange for trade privileges, the raids persisted. But the tipping point came in 1419, when Tsushima pirates, en route to invade Ming China, attacked Joseon's Biying County, sinking 7 warships and inflicting heavy casualties. Enough was enough. The Joseon court's answer: the largest anti-Wakou operation in history. The Kiehe expedition, known in Japan as the Oe invasion, saw 200 Joseon ships carrying over 17,000 troops storm Tsushima. They decimated pirate fleets, razed villages, and dealt a severe blow to Wakou operations. While piracy continued for several years after that, the invasion marked the beginning of the end for the first wave of Wakou. In 1443, the Joseon court and the Sou clan of Tsushima reached a compromise. With the Treaty of Kiehe, the clan was granted permission to send a total of 50 trade ships to Korea annually in exchange for curbing Wakou activity, an agreement that would shape the relations between Korea and Tsushima up all the way until the 19th century. Of course, there was still Ming China, which had suffered from Wakou attacks almost as much as Korea. It seems like pretty early on, they were somehow able to curb the Wakou menace by charming Prince Kaneyoshi, son of Emperor Go-Daigo, into taking action against the pirates. And with that, by the 1440s, a period of relative peace on the East Asian seas had arrived. Well, at least for a little while, because the second wave of Wakou activity was already on the horizon. There were several key factors that contributed to the resurgence of the Wakou. For one, Japan was about to enter its most turbulent period yet. The Sengoku or Warring States period that broke the entire country apart, severely weakening the central government that, actually had the power to keep Japanese piracy in check. At the same time, and perhaps as a result honestly, relations between Japan and China had deteriorated, which only helped to exacerbate tensions. The time was ripe for the Wakou to make a comeback. But somewhat ironically, among the ranks of these second-generation dwarf bandits or Japanese pirates, the Japanese represented merely a large minority, because this time they were overwhelmingly Chinese. From the 16th century onwards, the term Wakou, Woko, Wakou, whatever you want to call it, transformed into a much broader term, basically encompassing a multinational East Asian pirate network, rather than exclusively Japanese troublemakers at sea. Most of these new Wakou were actually legitimate Chinese traders, pushed into illegal activities by the Ming Dynasty's increasingly strict maritime trade bans at the time. These policies severely restricted trade, limiting it to irregular tribute missions, while at the same time the Chinese Navy was reduced significantly. And so, with few legal options left, desperate merchants eventually turned to smuggling and, when necessary, piracy. Of course, in the eyes of the Ming court, all these seafarers, whether they were former legitimate traders turned smugglers or actual violent raiders, all of them were simply lumped together as Wakou. It is said that the Ming court even paid out rewards to everyone who caught a Wakou, with payments allegedly categorized into different tiers depending on a pirate's nationality. If true, that's kind of ironic, because that would mean that they also admitted that the quote-unquote Japanese pirates were in fact not exclusively Japanese. Far from it. According to the Chinese text History of Ming, for instance, the Wakou of the second generation were about 70% Chinese and only 30% Japanese. And eventually, the term Wakou also included Koreans and even Portuguese as well. Basically, piracy in East Asia of the 16th century onward was a sprawling network made up of people from all different nationalities and walks of life. There were smugglers and raiders, but also merchants, traders, fishermen, perhaps even ronin, who all worked together to maintain maritime trade in the absence of actual trade routes. Some even collaborated with corrupt Ming officials and coastal populations, while others are said to have found close allies among powerful Japanese clans like the Ouichi, who are said to have been among the Wakou's biggest sponsors. Generally, the Japanese, though now numerically inferior to the Chinese, still played a vital role when it came to Wakou operations. They supplied weapons, military expertise, and once again, a base for East Asian piracy. Kyushu's illicit trade flourished, with Chinese merchants establishing markets there to trade silk for the Japanese silver that the Chinese desired so much. Actually, that's all that most Chinese traders were focused on initially. Commerce that just happened to be against the law due to strict trade bans. But over time, more and more of their ship crews developed a penchant for outright piracy, looting, violent raids, and the like. And during the 1550s, reports about violent Wakou raids on Chinese cities and settlements skyrocketed. Along much of the Chinese coastline and up the Yangtze River, the Wakou attacked and raided as they pleased, taking down one defense post after another. These raids only really slowed down after the pirates decided to concentrate their efforts in southern China's Fujian province. Besides their obvious activities in China and Japan, there are also reports claiming that the Wakou made it as far as Southeast Asia, more specifically the Philippines, possibly in an attempt to establish a foothold in fast-growing cities like Manila. Reliable information about their exact actions and activities there, however, seems to be rather scarce. The peak of the second-generation Wakou lasted until 1567, the year when China finally lifted its maritime trade bans, once again allowing open commerce with everyone, except the Japanese. A policy change that dramatically, though not entirely, reduced the incentive for illicit trade. Meanwhile in Japan, a new wave of powerful warlords was consolidating control with the goal of once again unifying the country. And one of them, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, targeted the Wakou directly. In 1588, he issued an edict banning piracy. Yeah, finally. Furthermore, Japan's territorial waters were now clearly defined, outlawing the use of force in order to settle maritime disputes, while lords who sponsored pirate activities, looking at you, So and Ouichi clans, now faced severe punishment. Despite all of these political and cultural developments and restrictions, the death of the Wakou was a slow one. Piracy lingered in Kyushu and beyond, the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 1600s signifying the beginning of the end. The new regime's central authority tightened its grip all over Japan, including Kyushu, which had historically remained somewhat out of reach for the central government, making it such a perfect home for pirates. Then there were Japan's isolationist policies that lasted all the way up to the late 19th century, the increased presence of Europeans in East Asia. Japanese piracy certainly held on for as long as it possibly could, but by the turn of the 18th century, the Wakou were well and truly a thing of the past. Got anything to add or share with us? Then make sure to set sail for the comment section. And for those of you who are already part of the Aniki crew on Patreon, much love goes out to all of you, including Bobby Wu, Ronan, Javier Sodavia, Capybara Chuck, Turam, Daniel Dees, RK0, Sierran DC, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yoka the Space Whale, Steve Matsui, Cats and Soup, Chart B-Man, Ben Harradine, and Metal Mama. And to everyone else who stumbled upon this video by sailing the treacherous waters of YouTube. Thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.